This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Glynn Tonsor, K-State livestock economist, starts today's show recapping the recent cattle market and highlighting the last meat demand monitor of 2025. The show continues with K-State weed scientist Pat Geier as he discusses the anniversary of 50 years of herbicide resistance in Kansas. He explains the first weed that had resistance. K-State's Pat Geier also ends the show as he talks about how to help reduce additional herbicide resistance for growers. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market and meat demand monitor update from K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, and Happy New Year, Shelby.
Glynn, what are we seeing for the cattle market?
So this past week was, for the most part, a positive week for the cattle market. Let's run down the cash series first. Is AMS called the 5 market fed cattle at about 232, called feeder cattle here in Dodge City market specifically, a full 10, if not $25 per hundredweight higher, depending on what specific lot I would give you here. And because of that, I actually wrote down 3 examples for our listeners. 136 head lot weighing 470, sold for 547 last week. 364 head lot weighing 581, sold for 467. And then the largest transaction was a large lot over 1,100 head, weighing 827, sold for 360. Those would all be up, particularly compared to a couple months earlier. But even with the prior week, there was quite a bit of strength in the cash feeder cattle market. Ongoing discussion about, we know the supplies are limited. There's been some positive development on the feedlot side we're going to talk about in a minute that I think has led to chasing those feeder cattle a little bit even more. And then this showed up for the most part on the board as well. So when you look at the CME futures contracts, the Friday close, February live cattle was 234. That was down almost $2 for the week. It's up about $25 from roughly a month ago, so early December. So it's been a nice recovery there. January feeder cattle closed Friday at 360, up $4 for the week. And there, the strength's even stronger, is up about $55 per hundred since early December. So to put a bow on that before I go any further, is lots of discussion about a pullback in the market in late October, front half of November, had a little bit of pause, calming down. And then for the most part, December leading into the first half of January, we've had a nice recovery, regardless of what weight class we're talking about.
And what are we seeing for boxed beef cutout?
Yeah, so this past week was strong there as well, up about $6 for both Choice and Select. Choice was quoted at 356 and Select was at 352. And as noted, that was up about $6 from the prior Friday. I had several reasons for that. We could talk food pyramid. It actually wasn't even on my notes, but I will say, I've done a lot of interviews about the federal announcement of the new pyramid and so forth. And protein being in is not new. One of the main things in 2025 was strong beef demand, and things like elevated cutout come along with that. It's good to see that for the industry.
And you mentioned the feedlot side of things. And today, Glenn, you have feedlot returns to share with us of what prices and numbers you're seeing.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about this on here for a couple months, so I'll back up for just a second. Is every month when all the data is available, we post on Ag Manager. I call it a barometer of returns in the Kansas Feed Yard series. So I'm taking a lot of information from the Animal Science and Industry Department here. So fake placement weight, outweight, death loss, that kind of stuff. Marrying it up with a whole bunch of fed cattle, feeder cattle, and corn price data for Kansas, and then forward-looking future stuff to do projections. I'm marrying all that up and kicking out a whole bunch of numbers. And every month you find that report. Over the weekend, I updated it, so that's what we're referring to here. You can go to Ag Manager and get the latest. Now, to put a bow on what this says is basically the first 6 months of the year. So steers leaving yards here in January all the way out through June. If they enter the yard unhedged and they remain unhedged, we're projecting $500, or better, basically each of those months, positive return per head. That was not the case like end of October when I was sitting here, because remember, the fed cattle market's improved a fair amount since then. So if you've remained open or naked to the market, you're being rewarded for it so far, is the summary of that. But when you flip this to the back half of 2026, when folks pull this up, they're going to start seeing some red numbers. So I'm projecting losses on animals that leave yards in July through, we currently project through Labor Day through September. And the main story there is not weakness on fed cattle. I mean, there's a small pullback in those projections, but the biggest thing is, over $100 per hundredweight increase in what you're paying for animal coming in. So the ongoing increase in feeder cattle kind of catches up with these margins is the point. And absent notable increases in fed cattle and or cost of gain, they squeeze margins. And that's showing up in these projections. So the first half of calendar year 26 continues to look good for the feedlot industry. And then as we turn the page, kind of think on 4th of July in your mind's eye, that story changes unless we get additional, support from the fed cattle price narrative.
And Glenn, always willing to talk about the meat demand monitor and starting off with willingness to pay for protein.
Yeah, so ongoing retail demand strength is there. You and I are talking here in the middle of January. So we're referring to the latest information is for December. So we compare in our base reports the December 2025 with November 2025. And for those that want to do this, everything from past months is available. So you can compare it to December of 24 and December 23 and so forth for longer trends. But what I want to impress on your listeners as we start 2026 is meat demand through the retail channel. So grocery store demand for at home remains quite strong. December demand was higher than November. December demand was higher than December of 24. The food service story is more mixed. So 5 of the 8 categories that we tracked was positive in December compared to November. And most of them were flat or down from December of 24. So I want to reiterate that without losing people in any numbers is folks are going out to restaurants a little bit less. And that leads to stronger grocery store demand for at-home consumption, and it leads to weaker food service demand for away from home. And that's important because we don't consume steers and barrows and broilers to round this out for all species in equal proportions, and we certainly don't by market share. So, high-end ribeye is consumed a little bit more away from home, as an example. So these food service versus retail channel distinctions are important, and they're a core part of why we do the MDM. But we continue to see grocery store demand carry the day for a broader demand story.
Do you see an increase in grocery store demand in December because maybe people are fixing holiday meals?
Oh, you certainly could, but I would remind us also, there's also a big holiday in November. So it's not just that. But more important than that is if you get away from month to month. So month to month is subject to seasonality, as you're alluding to, which is a good reminder. But the year over year shouldn't be. So if you have this December being higher than the one before, that's not really a holiday effect per se. It's something else because you had a holiday and New Year's and they're the same in each year. And that's why I encourage geeks like me to not just do the month over month, but also year over year to kind of, make sure we're not confounding just seasonality. So good question, but I think there's more to it than that here in 2025.
Also wanting to look at what's important when it comes to purchasing protein, and commonly these hold pretty steady. Is that still the case?
Yeah. So again, taste and freshness carry the day. Lots of discussion about the role of price. Again, the end of 2025, price indeed matters. But I'll interject here. A month ago, I spent a lot of time talking about the importance of price, but it is not the most important consideration for the typical American. There are some in our country where that is a leading decision. I understand that, but there's others where it's like 10th or 12th on the list. So on balance, it ranks as about 3rd per the MDM. And that is not a new thing. It hovers between 3rd and 4th, depending on what month you ask me.
How is it all coming together when we're looking at different proteins and what people are buying and then what they're also eating?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion. Some of this shows up every year in the holidays, but it feels like it's ratcheted up as 25 concluded about, the public sentiment and frustration, where we're at with inflation, the term affordability being thrown around more than probably normal, so forth. One of the things we do in the MDM is ask folks, how are your household finances compared to a year ago? And in December, 17% said they're better than a year ago. 36%, so over a third, said they're worse. And the balance, which is basically half our sample, said they're the same. Why am I saying that? The sentiment is bearish, right? People are frustrated with their finances on balance. And there's clear implications from that for basically anything in our economy. So if you Google, get on Yahoo Finance, you'll find this term called K-shaped economy. And this shows up where folks that are doing better than last year are disproportionately spending more on about everything in the economy. And that shows up in the meat context as well. So specifically within the MDM, we connect those sentiment with what did you buy yesterday and why? And you're way more likely to have had beef, pork, chicken, all the above, some combo of those 3 yesterday in multiple meals if you say your finances are improving, and you're way less likely if you tell me your finances are worsening. That's not surprising because meat is not one of the cheaper, items in your food basket, but there's a clear consumption and demand. That's just a consumption frequency number tied to that. And hopefully the MDM helps us not just monitor that, but do better understanding of that as we go through 2026. One of the key drivers I alluded to earlier is the food expenditure away from home is the key difference. So somebody that says they're doing better than last year spends a lot more, specifically $37 per week more on food is our estimate, than somebody that says they're doing worse. Conversely, they only spend about $10 more at the grocery store. So they spend more in both channels, but that differential is bigger away from home because folks that say my finances are worse are not going to the restaurants as often, and therefore their overall spending is down.
Glynn, if people are wanting to learn more about the cattle economy or look more into beef retail, what's a way they can do that?
I've mentioned demand because I spent a lot of time clarifying what demand is and how strong it is and how important it is. But I want to end our comments today with a shout out to Brian Coffey, colleague here in the Department of Ag Econ. Brian led a piece that I was on. You'll find it on Ag Manager as well, that breaks down the changes in 24 versus 23 and then our projections for how 2025 compared to 2024, specifically to try to isolate. We saw higher prices in the beef complex. How much of that was due to demand versus supply? And I want to give folks one final sound bite at the end, frankly, to bait them, hopefully to read this really important fact sheet that Brian led, is we estimate the price increase in 2025 versus 2024, 87% of that is due to demand increase. And 13, or with some rounding, 14% is due to supply changes. So changes in the herd size and pounds on the market matter. And I talk about that and we can clarify that. But the most important factor in the market was actually stronger consumer demand. That fact sheet that Brian led maps that out. I mean, there's graphs that document it using USDA data and so forth. It's not really our opinion. It's the data bearing it out. And for those that want more on that, please go to Ag Manager and bring that up.
Glynn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. I will link that fact sheet and the meat demand monitor in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show recognizing an anniversary for herbicide resistance with K-State weed specialist Pat Geier. Pat, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pat, as we're talking about herbicide resistance, what anniversary are we recognizing today?
Okay, well, this marks the 50th anniversary of the first documented case of herbicide resistance in the state. So in 1976, a kochia population was identified that was resistant to the herbicide atrazine. So it's been 50 years now since we've been dealing with this problem.
When we talk about herbicide resistance, can you define what it means?
Sure. Herbicide resistance is simply a natural process by which, after repeated use of the same herbicide over and over, we select for plants that have a genetic mutation that enable them to survive that herbicide, where prior to that genetic mutation, they were controlled by that herbicide. So it's a natural process.
Are there a couple of different categories of resistance?
Yes, ma'am. The simplest we call target site resistance, and that typically involves only one gene or one change in the genetic makeup of the plant. And what happens there is that genetic change causes the herbicide to no longer act upon what we call the target site in the plant. So either the herbicide does not bind to that target site, or the plant produces so many more target sites that it overwhelms our herbicide application. So that's the simplest form, target site resistance. We also have what we call non-target site resistance. And that's a little different critter because it usually involves multiple mutations, so different genes. And what happens in non-target site resistance is either the herbicide does not move in the plant, so it doesn't translocate. It gets sequestered in the plant, so what happens is the plant actually encapsulates that herbicide, and it's no longer able to move to the target site. or we can have metabolic resistance. In that case, what happens is the plant actually changes that herbicide into a compound that's no longer toxic to the plant before it reaches the target site. So non-target site resistance is a much tougher resistance to deal with.
Which resistance do you see more often?
Usually we see target site resistance because it's the simplest form, but we're getting to have more and more non-target site resistance, and that's becoming a bigger issue for us. So.
And looking 50 years ago, you mentioned kochia being the first resistant weed. And how was this discovered?
Quite simply, up in northeast Kansas, our counterpart there in Manhattan, the weed scientists, started hearing reports from along railway lines where they were using atrazine to control weeds. But they started noticing that some of these kochia plants were not being controlled by atrazine. So they got in contact with the weed scientists there at Manhattan, and they actually were the ones who first took the seeds from these plants into the greenhouse, and they screened them and discovered that, yes, we did actually have resistance to atrazine. So.
And kochia also had another resistance case a few years down the line too, correct?
That's correct. So the first case, as you said, was in 1976. It took about 11 years before we got another documented case of resistance. And again, it happened to be in kochia, but it was to a completely different family of herbicides. So.
When you think about kochia, Pat, are you surprised that it was the first weed to have resistance in Kansas?
No, I'm not. Several things with kochia make it a good candidate for resistance. One, kochia is a very genetically diverse species, so there's a lot of variation within that plant itself. So there's a lot of possibilities for genetics to shuffle and change. So from that respect, no, I'm not surprised. The other thing about kochia is it's one of our tumbleweeds. So it breaks off at the soil surface at maturity, and we often see these, at least in the western part of the state, blowing across the landscape. Well, if we do develop a resistant plant, then that tumbling mechanism will distribute that resistance far and wide. So I'm not at all surprised that kochia was one of the first was the first to develop resistance.
And as kochia took the first and second place spot, unfortunately, for herbicide resistance in weeds in Kansas, what weed came in next?
Palmer amaranth was the next weed to develop resistance. And Palmer amaranth is a very aggressive weed. It's actually a desert species that has moved into our agricultural areas. So where it gets a little bit of water and a little bit of heat, it likes to grow very big and be very competitive. The other thing about Palmer amaranth is it's what we call a dioecious species. And what I mean by that is some plants are female and some plants are male. So in order to produce seed, we have to have a mixing of genetic material between two different plants. And that speeds along this genetic mutation and also the cases of genetic or of resistance that we see. So.
For Palmer amaranth, are you seeing target site resistance or non-target site resistance?
We have seen both, and unfortunately the non-target site resistance has been very prevalent in our Palmer amaranth populations. That, coupled with the fact that it's such an aggressive weed, has really made it one of the most difficult weed resistance problems that we face in Kansas.
Is there another pigweed species that's also creating some issues when it comes to herbicide resistance?
Yes, ma'am. There is a very similar species called water hemp. Now, it's found only really in the eastern third of the state, but it's very similar to Palmer amaranth in that it's dioecious. So we get that genetic mixing quite often. And it's a large aggressive weed too. So it's particularly a problem in, say, soybeans back on the eastern part of the state. So yeah, it's another tough one. So.
And today we've mentioned kochia, water hemp, palmer amaranth. Are those the only 3 weeds showing resistance in Kansas?
No, ma'am. So far, we have documented 16 different weed species across the state that have herbicide resistance. So most of those, 13 of those species are broadleaf species. And there are 3 grass species currently in Kansas with confirmed herbicide resistance. Fortunately, all of these species are annual, so they reproduce by seed. So luckily, we don't have any perennial weeds such as bindweed or Johnson grass that have resistance at this time. So,
what does the process look like for identifying, yes, this weed has herbicide resistance?
That's a good question, Shelby. So normally we rely on either our producers or our county agents to identify populations that producers suspect are resistant. When we do get those reports, we will collect either plants themselves or seed samples from those populations. We'll take them into the greenhouse and grow them out in pots, and then we'll go through a series of herbicide applications, starting down at a low rate, or what we would probably say is a normal rate, up to several times the normal rate. And we'll look at the response of these plants. And if we have several plants that are surviving, I say a 1 or a 2x rate, then we can pretty well be assured that we've developed herbicide resistance in those plants. So there is also some molecular work, some genetic work that can be done in the lab to identify it, but that really takes a lot longer than our simple screenings that we do in the greenhouse.
That was Kansas State University weed scientist Pat Geier as he discussed the anniversary of 50 years of herbicide resistance in Kansas. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Pat as he continues sharing more information about this anniversary of herbicide resistance. If you're reaching your destination and aren't going to be able to hear the rest of today's show, but would like to, you can always find it on agtoday.net. If you're just wanting to read more about herbicide resistance in Kansas, I will link an agronomy eUpdate article in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break, but Pat and I will be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State weed scientist Pat Geier as we continue talking about 50 years of herbicide resistance in Kansas. Pat, as we're discussing this and thinking about herbicide resistance, what are some reminders for producers as we're thinking about not wanting to create any more resistance?
One of the very simplest things that we can do to limit herbicide resistance in weeds is to not use the same herbicides repeatedly. So let's say, for example, I spray dicamba 2, 3, 4 times a year, and I do this over 3, 4, or 5 years. I'm really setting myself up to select for dicamba resistant in my weeds. So if we rotate the herbicides that we use different modes of action during the year and between years, then that's going to help eliminate a lot of the selection pressure that we put on our weeds. The other things that we can do is, where appropriate, we can use a tillage to control weeds. That's not always appropriate for every situation. Some people don't like to do a lot of tillage, and that's good. That our conservation tillage is the backbone of our agriculture, but an occasional tillage can go a long way to help. Some other things we can do is using competitive crops, so crops that grow very tall or crops that are narrow row spacings that compete against these weeds. Those help. Where we have higher moisture in the state, we can use things such as cover crops to help smother weed growth, during those times of the year when we're not raising, say, a cash crop.
Pat, if you were to take an educated guess, do you think there's weeds that are out in Kansas that have herbicide resistance that we don't know about?
I would say that's almost certainly the case, Shelby. Yeah. Most times when we have a failure of a herbicide on a weed, it's for some other reason. About 90% of the failures are not resistance related. But we don't see every weed situation out there, so we certainly can't say, for example, that I know definitely that this is not a herbicide resistant case. There's so many of them out there that we don't have the people or the resources to screen every one of them, but I can say almost assuredly there is resistance out there that we're not aware of at this moment, yes.
And obviously we've focused towards Kansas today, but when we think about our bordering states, do we see the spread, the passing of herbicide resistance from one state to another? As we mentioned, some plants make it easier for that to move.
Sure. Yes, that's very common. Palmer amaranth is a good example of that. 30 years ago, we did not have a lot of Palmer amaranth in the western part of the state. Over the past 3 decades, it has really migrated west and become much more of a problem in the western part of the state. There is a report of a Palmer amaranth species in Arkansas that is resistant to one of our real popular herbicides, metolachlor. It's used quite a bit in corn and soybeans. Right now, we don't have any confirmed cases of metolachlor resistant Palmer in the state, but my guess is if it's not already here, it will be here before too terribly long.
Any other fun facts or anything you want to share, Pat?
No, I don't think I do, Shelby, at this point. I would certainly encourage anybody who has any questions, concerns, please reach out to your local or county extension, your area agronomist, or any of the weed science personnel here at K-State. We would always be happy to talk to you, and if you have any issues, please let us know. So,
Pat, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
thank you so much, Shelby. I do enjoy it.
That was K-State weed scientist Pat Geier. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.